For centuries, the Freemasons, I mean, the name itself, it just sparks so much intrigue, doesn't it? Secret meetings, ancient ritual.
Oh, absolutely. Images spring right to mind.
So today, we're really going to dig into that. Where did it all start? What's behind the symbols? We're looking at it through a pretty unique lens this time.
We are indeed. We're diving into a book called The Origin and Evolution of Freemasonry, connected with the origin and evolution of the human race.
Quite a title.
It is, by Dr. Albert Churchward, published way back in 1920. And, this specific copy had a bit of a story, came from Reverend James Leach's library.
Wow.
Yeah, and digitized later by the Internet Archive. University of Toronto funded that, so it's preserved.
Okay, so our goal here isn't just like listing historical dates as we know them now. It's more about getting into Churchward's perspective,
That's
right?
exactly.
Understanding his really ambitious attempt to connect Freemasonry way back.
Yeah.
Not just to history, but to human communication, symbols, consciousness even.
That's the core of it. Understanding his view and, the time he was writing in, early 20th century thinking.
Right. So what was his big idea, his central argument?
Well, it's definitely grand. Churchward basically argues that Freemasonry isn't some relatively new thing. He thinks its roots are tangled right up with the evolution of humankind itself.
Really? How far back?
All the way back.
Yeah.
To what he terms primitive man, to the very beginning of sign language, symbolic thought. That's where he places the origins.
Okay, hold on. So he's saying the earliest, grunts and gestures.
Yeah.
They're key to understanding the Masons.
That's pretty much it. He sees those first ways of communicating, especially signs, as absolutely foundational.
Huh.
And what's also really interesting is that he thought this core idea of brotherhood, which he believes stemmed from these ancient principles, was actually a solution.
A solution to what?
To the problems of his time. He specifically calls out socialism and anarchy. He felt this ancient inherent unity was the remedy.
Fascinating connection to make in 1920. Now, early in the book, he goes somewhere else entirely, talking about corpuscles. What's that about?
Yeah, it's quite something. He really tries to build his case from the ground up, you could say, from the basic nature of matter.
Corpuscles, like tiny particles.
Exactly. The fundamental building blocks of everything, in his view. He even came up with periodic laws of the corpuscle.
Laws.
Yeah, trying to link these tiny things to, believe it or not, human character. Whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, potentially linked back to these corpuscles.
So almost like a very early attempt at a kind of, scientific basis for personality, using 1920 science, obviously.
You could see it that way, yes.
Yeah.
And he uses this to then suggest, the possibility of evolution towards a higher type of homo.
Okay.
Implying that if we understood these laws, maybe we could guide human progress. But he wasn't purely materialistic either.
No.
No, he strongly argued for a spiritual life existing alongside the physical. Very much a product of the intellectual debates of his time, that mix of science and spirituality.
Right. So from these corpuscles, these building blocks, how does he define life itself then?
Well, connecting it all, he defines life as more than just how these corpuscles are arranged. He insists it's got both material and spiritual parts.
And the spirit.
He actually describes the spirit as being made of pure corpuscles, which sounds a bit odd, maybe, but it leads him to be quite skeptical of spiritualism, seances and that sort of thing.
Ah, I see. He saw that as different from this inherent spiritual aspect of life.
Exactly. He saw his spiritual life as fundamental, not something conjured up.
Okay. And what about Darwin? How did Churchward view evolution?
Well, this is where you see him engaging with the big scientific ideas. He accepts parts of Darwin's theory, sure, but he also pushes back.
On what specifically?
He particularly had issues with how Darwinism, as he saw it, explained racial differences and national psychology. He felt there was more to it. He even mentions a Mr. Kidd's work in that context.
Interesting. He thought there were inherent traits beyond just selection.
It seems so. He believed certain characteristics were more fixed. And he also brings in some archaeological points here, too.
Oh, yeah. But like what?
He talks about finding what he calls stellar cult skeletons, supposedly in Pliocene strata in Lombardy.
Pliocene, that's old.
Very old. It's an example where he tries to anchor his theories in physical evidence, though, modern archaeology would look at those claims very differently.
Right. Context is key. Okay, let's shift gears to communication, which seems central for him. He really pushes sign language, doesn't he? Believes it came first.
Absolutely. He's adamant. Sign language was the first human communication, predating speech.
How does he picture that?
He talks about primitive man using pantomime, gestures, acting out wants and needs. He sees this visual communication as the absolute root.
And he connects this to early gods, like Egyptian gods.
He does, yeah. He uses examples like Set, Horus, Shu, how they were often shown in animal form, zootypic forms.
Right.
And he argues this wasn't just artistic choice. It was tied directly to sign language and totemism. The animal was the sign, communicating power or an attribute.
And the stellar cult people come in here again?
Yes, he circles back to them, suggesting they were key players in developing these early signs and symbols further.
Okay, these stellar cult people. We need to pin down who he thinks they were. But first, he talks about pygmies.
He does. Before the stellar cult, he focuses on what he sees as the earliest stage, the pre-totemic Homo, and he identifies them specifically as the Pygmies of Africa.
From Africa.
Yes, he even includes a map showing Africa as the home of primary man. Very specific, based on the anthropology of his day, of course.
And they had symbols, too.
Oh, yes. He highlights what he calls the original Pygmy sacred sign, 3 cross sticks. He then traces how this simple sign evolved into other forms later on.
So he's building a lineage of symbols.
Exactly. A line he believes leads eventually towards Freemasonry. He also talks about a second creation here, the emergence of man and woman within totemism, seeing that as a huge step forward socially and symbolically.
Okay, so from these pygmies and their signs, we move to totemic people. How does he describe that stage?
He sees totemic sociology as the very first type of government, an organized society based on these totemic symbols and kinship groups.
And the pillars. He mentions pillars.
Yes, the 2 pillars or poles used in totemic ceremonies. He interprets them as representing the north and south divisions of the heavens. Crucially, he links these same pillars to the later stellar and solar cults, too.
So a continuing symbol.
A foundational symbol, adapted over time. He also mentions the Nilotic Negroes, suggesting their sacred signs were also part of this evolution, adopting and modifying earlier forms.
It's like a symbolic relay race through history in his view.
Kind of, yeah. And he emphasizes the core duality here, the 2 primal elemental powers, darkness and light. Set and Horus in Egypt are his prime examples. And then he lays out this progression. Stellar cult, then lunar, then solar cults. He even suggests that different physical, anatomical traits corresponded to people in these different cult stages.
Wow, okay. That's a big claim. Now let's get back to the stellar cult. This sounds really pivotal in his theory for Freemasonry.
It absolutely is. For Churchward, the stellar cult people achieve something massive. They turn sign language into written language, ideographic hieroglyphics.
The first written language.
That's his assertion. And he saw them as having a global presence, pointing to temples built with distinctive polygonal stones found all over the world as their mark.
And this is where he brings in the operative and speculative Masons.
Precisely. He identifies the operative Masons as the original builders from this stellar cult era, the practical ones, the stone workers.
And the speculative.
They came later, in his view, focusing more on the philosophy, the symbolism, the meaning behind the building, and the ancient knowledge. Doing first, then understanding.
He gets quite specific about an early initiation ceremony too, doesn't he? What did that involve?
Yes, and it's fascinating how he draws parallels. He describes the candidate dressed to symbolize being untutored, like raw nature.
Okay.
Then there's a chain, or rope, signifying being led out of darkness.
Into light.
Into light, exactly.
Right.
A hood or veil over the eyes. A watcher, guarding the entrance. He mentions the symbolic word, shura.
Shura.
And key symbols like the equilateral triangle, the square stone. The whole thing is a symbolic journey, darkness to light, ending with instruction.
And writing was developed by this group, this brotherhood, to preserve all this.
That's Churchward's argument. Written language was created by the Brotherhood specifically to safeguard their knowledge and traditions. He even points to his own translation of a Hittite inscription as, like, unlocking this ancient wisdom.
Right. Okay, moving through his timeline. After the stellar cult, he brings in the lunar and solar cults. How did they follow?
He sees the lunar cult developing next, logically, as people started reckoning time by the moon cycles instead of just the stars.
Makes sense.
And then following that, the solar cult emerges. And a key shift happens here. Depictions of gods become fully human, replacing the older animal forms.
Ah, more anthropomorphic.
Yes, a shift towards focusing on the human form and divinity.
And within this solar cult, that's where the 10 greater mysteries of Amenta come in.
Correct. These are presented as part of the solar cult framework. He calls them logical, basically dealing with the afterlife and cosmic order.
We're representing Earth's eternity.
That's his interpretation. And Tot, or Thoth, is the great teacher figure associated with these deeper secrets. He positions these as more advanced than the earlier 7 lesser mysteries he linked to the stellar cult.
Okay. He then talks about Horus of the Double Horizon. What's the significance there?
For Churchward, this figure, Horus of the Double Horizon, is all about unity. Specifically, unifying North and South, a huge concept in Egyptian cosmology, representing balance and harmony.
And how is that shown symbolically?
He points again to the symbolism of the 2 pillars or poles, and also the use of 2 circles, representing that unified duality. He also mentions the disk worship, the cult of Aten.
Akhenaten's time.
Yes, that brief period of arguably monotheism as an early form of this solar cult thinking.
And Horus himself appears in different ways.
Oh, many ways. Churchward details Horus as a child, as a bull, even a fish man, and of course the Sphinx. Each form carrying symbolism tied to the sun's journey, death, resurrection, rebirth themes.
And this connects into the later Osirian story too.
Exactly. He touches on the Osirian cult and how Horus's role was adapted and reinterpreted within that major framework later on.
Right. So finally, he really digs into how religious ideas evolved and the meaning of those 10 greater mysteries.
Yeah, in the later chapters, he argues that myths weren't just stories. They grew out of observing nature and attributing amazing powers to natural forces or phenomena. He restates his idea that the stellar cult was global first, but then largely replaced by the solar cult. And then he elaborates quite a bit on those 10 greater mysteries of Amenta.
What more does he say about them?
He presents them as a sequence of initiations focused squarely on the afterlife, on resurrection. He mentions specific concepts like the Earth of Amenta, the underworld realm, the funeral bed, and the whole symbolic journey the deceased soul had to take.
Sounds complex. Were there trials involved?
Yes, he talks about 7 arits, or mansions like stages of a final test. You needed specific knowledge, passwords almost, to get through them.
Huh.
He even finds the origin of the hellfire concept in these Egyptian mysteries. And the final degree, the ultimate initiation, he describes as this incredibly tough test of knowledge and morality.
Wow. Okay, so we've journeyed through Dr. Churchward's entire thesis, this incredibly detailed, sweeping vision. What's the main thing we should take away?
I think the biggest takeaway is just the sheer scale of his project, his ambition in trying to forge this unbroken line from the dawn of humanity through Egypt, right up to Freemasonry, using sign language, symbolism, evolution. It's quite a construction.
Definitely ambitious. And often pretty speculative, as you said.
Oh, very speculative by today's standards. It's a fascinating attempt, though.
And we absolutely have to keep in mind when he was writing, early 1900s.
Crucial context. His ideas are so deeply embedded in the scientific and anthropological thinking and maybe biases of that specific time. So as you listen to this, it's worth thinking about how his interpretations line up or maybe really clash with how we understand history and symbols now.
Definitely. So let's leave everyone with a final thought to chew on. Churchward put immense weight on this idea of ancient wisdom, this primordial brotherhood, stretching back to the very start.
Right. These foundational principles.
So thinking about that, what parts of our modern world, our society today, might Churchward have looked at and seen as, well, as either living up to those ancient ideals or maybe as completely contradicting the truths he believed he'd found?
That's a really interesting question to ponder. What would he make of us now, based on his framework?
Something for you all to think about. It certainly makes you consider these big themes: connection, knowledge, the search for meaning across the vast sweep of history.